September 2nd, 1967. Route 19, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. Specialist Sammy Say gripped the steering wheel of his deuce-and-a-half cargo truck. The convoy rolled through terrain the drivers called Ambush Alley. 37 trucks hauled aviation fuel from Pleiku to An Khe. Green canvas covered vehicles following standard military transportation protocols. Say's truck looked regulation enough from distance. Olive drab paint, military markings, canvas top stretched over cargo bed. But something was wrong about the truck ahead of him. Where canvas should hang loose, steel plates gleamed in morning sun. Sandbags lined the bed edges. Twin M60 machine gun barrels protruded from what should have been empty cargo space. The lead vehicle hit a mine at about 0730 hours, and the world exploded into coordinated chaos. AK-47 fire erupted from tree lines on both sides. RPGs streaked across the kill zone trailing smoke. Hand grenades rained down from elevated positions. Say watched the modified truck ahead open fire with weapons no cargo hauler was authorized to carry. Twin M60s hammering positions that would have destroyed an unprotected convoy within seconds. 31 trucks were disabled within 10 minutes. 7 drivers died. But the improvised gun truck kept firing, its homemade armor absorbing rounds that should have shredded through canvas and killed everyone inside. What the army brass had called junkyard modifications and specifically warned against had just saved lives. Through firepower, no regulation anticipated, and armor, no manual authorized. The young truck drivers of the 8th Transportation Group were proving that American ingenuity under fire didn't wait for authorization. It welded steel plates to cargo beds, mounted machine guns scrounged from helicopter maintenance, painted intimidating names on vehicles officers pretended not to see, because the alternative was watching convoys burn and drivers die, on roads where ambush was certainty, and homemade armor was the only thing standing between fuel deliveries and total mission failure. The killing began at 1855 hours on Route 19, about 10 miles east of Mangjiang Pass. 39 empty trucks from the 8th Transportation Group were returning from Pleiku to Quy Nhon. After delivering fuel and ammunition to the 1st Cavalry Division, a 5,000-gallon fuel tanker struggled to maintain convoy speed and fell behind, splitting the column into 2 sections, separated by 500 meters. The convoy commander understood the danger immediately. Only 2 M151 jeeps armed with M60 machine guns provided security, and the divided convoy meant neither section could support the other if attacked. The lead jeep rounded a curve, and a 57mm recoilless rifle round struck it directly, killing 1 soldier instantly and wounding 2 others. Within seconds, about 50 North Vietnamese Army regulars opened fire from concealed positions in the tree line on the south side of the highway. 29 trucks were caught in a 700-meter kill zone. The enemy had positioned weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire ambush area. 57mm rockets slammed into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th trucks, disabling them before drivers could react. Command detonated mines exploded beneath vehicles. AK-47 fire raked canvas-covered cargo beds. Simultaneously, gunners at the rear of the convoy scored direct hit on the 5,000-gallon fuel tanker that had fallen behind. The tanker erupted, but miraculously didn't explode, fuel streaming across pavement as the driver bailed out, seconds before fire consumed the cab. The vulnerability of Standard Transportation Corps operations was absolute. Cargo trucks spread across miles of road with minimal security couldn't defend themselves or maneuver effectively when ambushed. Canvas tops provided no protection against small arms fire. Drivers carried M16 rifles but couldn't effectively return fire while controlling vehicles on narrow mountain roads. The few Jeep-mounted M60s couldn't suppress 50 enemy positions simultaneously. Transportation doctrine assumed convoy speed and escort would deter ambush. The North Vietnamese proved that assumption fatal by concentrating forces at choke points where convoys slowed to navigate terrain. Some drivers survived through desperate improvisation and sheer luck, those who could accelerated through the kill zone, weaving around disabled vehicles while rounds impacted around them. Others bailed from trucks and returned fire from ditches. One driver used his cargo truck to shield other vehicles, deliberately blocking the road while firing his M16 at muzzle flashes in the tree line. A company from the 1st Cavalry Division stationed less than a mile away loaded into helicopters within minutes and flew toward the ambush site. But 15 minutes elapsed before they arrived, and by then, the engagement had ended. The North Vietnamese faded into jungle as helicopter gunships raked the tree line with machine gun fire. The butcher's bill was devastating and undeniable. 17 drivers killed, 17 wounded, 30 vehicles damaged or destroyed. 7 families would receive telegrams. 17 wounded men proved the current system was systematically killing soldiers, whose job was hauling fuel and ammunition, not fighting infantry battles. Transportation Corps commanders could no longer pretend convoy security doctrine worked. The September 2nd ambush demonstrated that canvas-covered cargo trucks operating on predictable routes with minimal security were death traps, and continuing current operations meant accepting casualties that would eventually make supply missions impossible. But within days of the massacre, truck drivers across Vietnam began scrounging steel plates from destroyed vehicles and welding armor onto cargo beds without waiting for official authorization, proving that when regulations meant death and survival meant improvisation, American soldiers would write their own doctrine, regardless of what manuals specified or officers pretended not to see. The transformation began in motor pools across Vietnam. Within 72 hours of the September 2nd massacre, specialist Sammy Say and several drivers from the 8th Transportation Group gathered around a deuce-and-a-half cargo truck at their Quignon motor pool, armed with cutting torches, welding equipment, and determination to never ride defenseless into another ambush. They started with materials no manual authorized but every junkyard provided: steel plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles, lumber from construction sites, sandbags piled 3 feet high along cargo bed walls. C and his crew knew modification without authorization risked disciplinary action. Army regulations specified that no vehicle alterations were permitted, without extensive testing by manufacturers and approval from higher command. But regulations written in air-conditioned offices didn't account for ambushes that killed 7 men in 10 minutes. The engineering was crude but functional. Drivers welded half-inch steel plates to the floor and lower sides of cargo beds, creating barriers against small arms fire and mine fragments. They stacked sandbags along the walls, building firing positions that protected gunners while allowing clear fields of fire. 2x4 lumber-framed gun boxes where crew served weapons could be mounted. The steel came from everywhere: destroyed trucks in salvage yards, damaged APC hulls, even blown bunkers and damaged equipment. Nobody asked questions when steel plates disappeared from scrap piles. Survival trumped bureaucracy. Weapons presented greater challenge. Transportation units were authorized minimal armament: M14 rifles for drivers, a few M60 machine guns for headquarters staff, maybe an M79 grenade launcher per squad. This firepower couldn't suppress 50 enemy positions. C and other crew chiefs began bartering with helicopter units for M60 machine guns. They traded cigarettes, liquor, captured AK-47s, and promises of future favors. For weapons officially allocated elsewhere, some simply borrowed guns from maintenance shops and never returned them. One crew chief secured twin M60s by offering Air Force mechanics a case of scotch and 3 days of labor repairing trucks. The unofficial supply chain operated through connections, trades, and deliberate blindness. from officers who understood that dead drivers couldn't testify about unauthorized weapons. The first modified trucks rolled out on convoy missions in late September 1967. Instead of defenseless canvas-covered cargo haulers, gun trucks bristled with visible firepower, twin M60s mounted in elevated gun boxes, crews wearing flak jackets and helmets, steel plates gleaming where canvas should hang. The psychological impact was immediate. Viet Cong scouts who previously targeted isolated trucks now observed convoys protected by armored vehicles. Carrying concentrated firepower, several planned ambushes were aborted when scouts reported gun trucks in convoys. The improvised armor worked not just by stopping bullets, but by deterring attacks through visible strength. But the modifications created problems no field manual addressed. Sandbags became waterlogged in monsoon rains, adding tons of weight that buckled suspension systems. Deuce-and-a-half trucks designed to carry 5,000 pounds sagged under loads exceeding 8,000. Engines overheated from extra weight. Steering became dangerously unresponsive. Brake systems failed. Several modified trucks broke down on convoy runs, becoming liabilities rather than assets. The added weight also reduced fuel efficiency and created maintenance nightmares for mechanics trying to keep overloaded vehicles operational. Army brass faced difficult decision. The gun trucks violated regulations, created maintenance problems, and represented soldiers taking matters into their own hands without authorization. Yet they demonstrably reduced casualties and improved convoy security. Officers at battalion and brigade level pretended not to notice. As modifications spread across transportation units, some quietly approved steel shipments to motor pools. Others redirected M60 machine guns to transportation companies without explaining why. The unofficial policy became, if it works and saves lives, we didn't see it being built. By October 1968, factory-made hardening kits arrived at transportation units across Vietnam, transforming improvised field modifications into semi-official doctrine. The Army had reluctantly acknowledged what drivers proved through blood and salvaged steel. Gun trucks worked. Engineers at Fort Eustis designed standardized steel gun boxes, with double walls separated by 18 inches of space, creating barriers that could withstand RPG impacts through spall protection. The kits arrived in crates marked with technical specifications. That legitimized what months earlier had been unauthorized modifications subject to disciplinary action. The evolution required abandoning deuce-and-a-half trucks for heavier platforms. M39 and M54 5-ton 6x6 cargo trucks became the standard base vehicle, their more powerful engines and reinforced chassis capable of handling armor weight. That had crippled lighter trucks. The standardized gunbox design bolted to the outside of truck beds initially, then evolved into double wall construction with inner and outer steel plates. Some units mounted M113 armored personnel carrier hulls directly onto truck beds, when steel shortages prevented gunbox construction. The final evolution positioned steel walls inside truck beds rather than outside. Improving weight, distribution and structural integrity, weapon systems evolved from single M60 machine guns into devastating combinations of firepower. Twin-mounted M60s became standard, but crews who could acquire them mounted M2 Browning 50-caliber heavy machine guns. Capable of punching through light fortifications, a few legendary gun trucks secured M134 miniguns, electrically driven Gatling guns capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute, weapons designed for helicopter door guns, but adapted to truck mounts through ingenuity and unofficial supply channels. Quad-mounted 50-caliber anti-aircraft guns appeared on some trucks until 1969. Though their inability to depress fire angles and excessive crew requirements led to discontinuation, each gun truck carried crews of 4 to 5 men, driver, 2 to 3 gunners, and a non-commissioned officer in charge, who coordinated fire and communications. The trucks developed identities through names painted in large letters on armor plates. Eve of Destruction became legendary in the 8th Transportation Group, armed with twin .50 calibers and crew reputation for aggressive tactics. Ace of Spades earned fame for turning ambushes into Viet Cong massacres. Cold Sweat, Iron Butterfly, Pandemonium, The Executioner, Bounty Hunter. Each name represented not just vehicle, but crew bonds, forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. Black paint replaced olive drab despite regulations, crews reasoning that intimidating appearance enhanced psychological warfare. Unit commanders ordered yellow noses painted on all vehicles for identification from helicopters overhead, but gun truck crews customized even these required markings into distinctive patterns. The first purpose-built gun trucks proved devastating in convoy defense operations. On November 24, 1967, gun trucks engaged Viet Cong ambush forces on Route 19 and inflicted 41 confirmed kills while forcing withdrawal, despite losing 6 cargo trucks and 4 gun trucks damaged. The engagement demonstrated that gun trucks transformed convoy ambushes from one-sided massacres into costly engagements the enemy couldn't sustain. Viet Cong scouts began reporting gun truck presence to commanders planning ambushes, and several planned attacks were cancelled when intelligence indicated hardened convoys with multiple gun trucks, but improved armor and firepower meant the enemy adapted tactics, rather than abandoning convoy attacks. Instead of small unit harassment, Viet Cong concentrated forces at optimal ambush sites, where terrain channeled convoys through kill zones before gun trucks could respond effectively. They employed larger mine placements capable of destroying 5-ton trucks despite armor. RPG teams positioned to target gun trucks first, understanding that eliminating the hardened vehicles restored advantage. The arms race between convoy protection and ambush tactics continued, escalating, proving that while gun trucks dramatically improved survival odds, they couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of supply convoys operating on predictable routes through hostile territory, controlled by enemy forces who chose when and where to engage. Transportation Corps commanders understood by early 1968 that gun trucks alone couldn't solve convoy security. Doctrine required complete overhaul. Colonel Joe O. Bellino, who assumed command of the 8th Transportation Group in October 1967, championed systematic approach to hardened convoy operations rather than relying on individual improvisation. The challenge was institutional. Transportation units trained soldiers to drive trucks and maintain vehicles, not to fight coordinated defensive battles against prepared ambushes. Converting convoy operations into combat missions required new training, command structures, and tactical procedures. That challenged decades of Transportation Corps doctrine. The hardened convoy concept emerged through lessons written in blood and documented in after-action reports. Gun trucks were positioned at specific intervals throughout convoys: lead truck, 1/3 back, 2/3 back, and tail position. This spacing ensured that regardless where ambush occurred, at least one gun truck could respond within seconds. Radio communication became mandatory, with gun truck commanders maintaining constant contact, and convoy commanders positioned in hardened vehicles near convoy center. Pre-planned responses to ambush replaced panicked reactions. Gun trucks moved toward contact, while cargo trucks accelerated through kill zones. Wounded vehicles were pushed aside rather than blocking roads. Crews trained to dismount only when absolutely necessary. Because remaining in armored vehicles increased survival odds, training evolved from driving instruction into combat operations course. Crews learned suppressive fire techniques, immediate action drills for various ambush scenarios, vehicle recovery under fire, and coordinated maneuver. Gun truck crews became specialists who volunteered for duty, understanding they would see more combat than many infantry soldiers. The volunteers were typically experienced soldiers seeking action, or truck drivers who had survived ambushes and refused to remain defenseless. 5-man crews operated each gun truck, driver with combat experience, vehicle commander, usually a sergeant, and 3 gunners trained on specific weapon systems. Crew cohesion became critical as gun trucks developed reputations through repeated engagements. By late 1969, perfected doctrine demonstrated measurable success. Convoy casualties dropped dramatically compared to 1967 levels. Ambushes became costlier for Viet Cong forces, facing concentrated firepower that killed attackers faster than they could kill truck drivers. The 8th Transportation Group documented that hardened convoys transformed ambush calculations. What had been one-sided massacres became engagements where American forces often inflicted heavier casualties than they sustained. Intelligence reports indicated Viet Cong commanders hesitated to attack convoys with multiple gun trucks, seeking softer targets elsewhere. The institutional shift represented validation of bottom-up problem-solving over top-down planning. Enlisted soldiers identified vulnerability, improvised solutions, and proved effectiveness. Before Army leadership acknowledged the program officially, this pattern contradicted military culture that emphasized following established doctrine and waiting for authorized equipment. Yet the gun truck program succeeded precisely because soldiers refused to die, while bureaucracy debated solutions. Officers who initially warned against unauthorized modifications eventually championed the program. After witnessing results, the Army added new chapter to Transportation Corps history by acknowledging that field innovation sometimes preceded official doctrine rather than following it. But success came with cost that statistics couldn't capture. Gun truck crews faced constant combat exposure that approached infantry casualty rates. Between 1967 and 1972, numerous gun truck crewmen were killed or wounded during ambushes. The vehicles that protected convoys became bullet magnets once enemy identified them as primary threats. Viet Cong adapted tactics continuously. Larger mines targeted 5-ton gun trucks specifically. RPG teams concentrated fire on gun trucks before engaging cargo vehicles. Coordinated attacks attempted to destroy gun trucks in opening seconds to eliminate convoy firepower. The arms race between protection and attack methods continued escalating until American withdrawal, proving that while gun trucks dramatically improved survival odds, they couldn't eliminate fundamental vulnerability of supply convoys operating through hostile territory on predictable routes, where enemy chose when and where to engage. Eve of Destruction became the most feared gun truck on Route 19. Between late 1967 and 1970, built on an M54 5-ton chassis, the truck mounted twin M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns in a double-walled steel gun box that could withstand RPG impacts through spall protection. The crew of 5, driver, NCOIC, and 3 gunners, developed reputation for aggressive tactics. That transformed convoy escort from defensive posture into active hunting. When ambushes erupted, Eve of Destruction didn't just suppress fire, it drove directly into kill zones and saturated enemy positions with firepower that could shred light fortifications and vegetation, forcing Viet Cong withdrawal before they could inflict significant damage on convoys. The Ace of Spades earned its legend through different path. Originally built from salvaged gun box of destroyed truck, Proud American, which operated only 21 days before being destroyed in ambush. The Ace inherited both equipment and determination from its predecessor. The crew painted the oversized Ace of Spades symbol on armor plates. Psychological warfare borrowed from card decks left on enemy dead by infantry units. The Ace participated in dozens of engagements along Route 19 and Highway 1, with crew developing tactics that anticipated ambush locations and pre-positioned weapons to engage simultaneously with first enemy shots. Gun truck crews became elite volunteers known throughout transportation units. Young soldiers aged 19 to 23 who had survived their first ambush often requested transfer to gun truck duty. Understanding the role meant constant combat exposure, but also meant never feeling helpless again. The crews developed brotherhoods similar to infantry platoons, living together, training together, fighting together. Each truck evolved distinct identity through crew customization. Elaborate artwork painted on armor plates, trophies from destroyed enemy weapons mounted on gun boxes, unit patches and personal insignia that transformed regulation olive drab into intimidating war paint, cold sweat, pandemonium, iron butterfly, the executioner. The names weren't just labels, but statements of intent painted in letters 3 feet high. The combat statistics documented what crews proved through blood. On February 12, 1969, 4 gun trucks engaged coordinated ambush on Highway 1. That involved about 100 Viet Cong fighters positioned in prepared positions. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. Gun truck crews killed 36 confirmed enemy, wounded estimated 50 more, and forced withdrawal despite losing 1 gun truck disabled by mine and 3 cargo trucks destroyed. The convoy completed its mission. Similar engagements occurred weekly throughout 1969 through 1970, demonstrating that gun trucks had transformed convoy ambushes from one-sided massacres into costly defeats for enemy forces. Individual acts of heroism emerged from these engagements. On May 18, 1970, Specialist 4 Jimmy Wayne Dahl threw himself on enemy grenade to save his gun truck crew, posthumously receiving the Medal of Honor. Numerous gun truck crewmen received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for valor, demonstrated during ambushes when they maintained fire despite wounds, or stayed with burning convoys providing covering fire for evacuation. The young soldiers who volunteered for gun truck duty became hardened combat veterans through exposure that matched infantry units, developing skills and courage forged through repeated brushes with death. But the statistics couldn't hide cost. Between 1967 and 1972, gun truck crews sustained casualty rates approaching infantry levels. The armor that protected them also identified them as priority targets. Viet Cong learned to concentrate initial fire on gun trucks, attempting to destroy them in opening seconds before they could respond. Larger mines specifically targeted 5-ton trucks. Coordinated RPG teams aimed for weak points in armor. Several gun trucks were destroyed despite protection. Crews killed by explosions that penetrated steel walls, or mines powerful enough to flip vehicles. The brotherhood that formed among crews meant watching friends die in vehicles they'd helped build, understanding that tomorrow might bring the same fate. Yet volunteers continued stepping forward, proving that some soldiers measured worth not through survival, but through refusing to let convoy drivers face ambushes defenseless, even when defense meant accepting odds that approached certainty of combat and possibility of death. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. Between 1967 and 1972, gun truck crews sustained casualty rates that approached infantry levels, despite armor that should have protected them. The 8th Transportation Group lost dozens of men killed and wounded during convoy operations, with gun truck crews representing disproportionate percentage of casualties. Each telegram sent to families began with identical words, explaining their sons had been killed in action while operating gun trucks in convoy security operations. The families received neither details of heroism nor comfort beyond standard condolences. Their sons had died driving supply trucks, a fact that seemed impossible to reconcile with combat-level casualties. Specialist 4 Jimmy Wayne Dahl threw himself on enemy grenade during ambush on May 18, 1970, saving his gun truck crew but dying from wounds sustained. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Sergeant Jimmy Dale Stoner was killed when RPG penetrated his gun truck's armor on Route 19, proving that even double-walled steel couldn't guarantee survival. Staff Sergeant William Say, who had helped build the first improvised gun trucks after September 2nd massacre, survived his tour. but watched multiple friends die in vehicles they'd welded together in motor pools. The survivors carried psychological burdens that manifested decades later: nightmares of burning trucks, guilt over friends killed when mines destroyed vehicles despite armor, constant vigilance that never diminished even when convoys ended. Some gun trucks were destroyed despite protection that should have saved crews. On March 24, 1971, the proud American II, successor to original destroyed in 1967, hit command detonated mine, containing estimated 300 pounds of explosives. The blast flipped the 5-ton truck completely over, killing 2 crew members instantly and wounding 3 others critically. Eve of Destruction survived multiple RPG hits during its operational life, but was eventually destroyed by concentrated rocket fire that penetrated gun box and ignited ammunition. King Cobra was disabled by mine in 1970. Crew evacuated seconds before secondary explosions consumed the vehicle. The trucks that became legendary for invincibility eventually proved vulnerable when enemy concentrated sufficient firepower or employed mines large enough to overcome armor through sheer explosive force. Between 300 and 400 gun trucks operated throughout the war, each representing crews who volunteered repeatedly for duty they understood meant constant combat exposure. The volunteers came from 2 categories: drivers who had survived ambushes and refused to remain defenseless, and combat-seeking soldiers who found transportation duty boring, until discovering gun trucks offered action exceeding many infantry assignments. They formed bonds similar to infantry platoons, living together, training together, fighting together, watching friends die together. The question that haunted many was whether keeping supply lines open justified casualties. That mounted steadily despite improved tactics and armor. Gun truck crews answered that question through continued volunteering despite knowing odds. They understood convoys required protection, that without gun trucks, casualty rates among regular cargo drivers would return to 1967 levels, that their role saved lives even when it cost their own. Specialist Daniel Condon, who served on gun truck crew throughout 1969 to 1970 tour, later wrote that every convoy mission felt like accepting potential death, but allowing supply drivers to face ambushes defenseless felt more immoral than accepting risk themselves. The crews measured worth not through survival, but through convoys protected and drivers saved, creating calculus where personal danger became subordinate to mission completion. But as American forces withdrew from Vietnam between 1971 and 1973, gun trucks faced final indignity. The vehicles that had saved countless lives and represented American ingenuity under fire were too heavy and modified to justify shipping home. Most were abandoned at bases or driven to salvage yards and destroyed. Eve of Destruction, Ace of Spades, and dozens of other legendary trucks were cut apart or left to rust, erasing physical evidence of innovation that had transformed convoy operations. Crews who had served on these vehicles watched them destroyed, understanding that military efficiency demanded disposal, but feeling that something more than metal was being lost: memory of brotherhood forged in combat, proof that soldiers would innovate solutions when official doctrine failed, and testament to courage demonstrated daily by young men who volunteered to paint intimidating names on armor plates and ride into ambushes because convoys needed protection, regardless of personal cost. The question returned decades later, when American convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan began improvising armor from scrap metal and sandbags in 2003 through 2004. Why did soldiers have to improvise protection instead of army providing it? The answer revealed uncomfortable truth about military procurement. Bureaucracy moves slowly, soldiers die quickly, and the gap between threat and response gets filled by field innovation or casualties. Gun trucks in Vietnam demonstrated this pattern first, establishing precedent that would repeat in every conflict since. when institutional systems failed to match tactical reality. The gun truck concept influenced modern convoy security in ways that vindicated 1967 improvisers. In April 2004, the 518th Transportation Company formed at Camp Navistar, Kuwait, as Provisional Gun Truck Company, acquiring 35 Humvees and 5 M939 5-ton trucks, that crews modified with improvised armor and 50 caliber machine guns, exact repetition of Vietnam pattern 40 years later. Representative Duncan Hunter, chairman of House Armed Services Committee, championed standardized Hunter box armored enclosures for 5-ton trucks. After Vietnam veterans consulted on design, the Army eventually deployed MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, purpose-built for convoy security, but only after soldiers spent months welding hillbilly armor onto vehicles, because waiting for proper equipment meant accepting casualties. The lesson was simple, but apparently required learning repeatedly. Bottom-up innovation works when soldiers face immediate threats, and bureaucracy moves slowly. Gun trucks demonstrated that enlisted soldiers closest to problems often develop solutions faster than acquisition programs operating through channels designed for peacetime procurement. The 8th Transportation Group added new chapter to Transportation Corps history by documenting what worked rather than waiting for doctrine to authorize experimentation. Their after-action reports became training materials. Their gun truck designs influenced standardized hardening kits. Their tactical employment doctrine, positioning gun trucks at specific intervals, coordinated response to ambush, dedicated weapons platforms rather than self-defense systems on cargo trucks, remained valid through end of American logistical operations in Vietnam, and reappeared nearly unchanged in Iraq convoy security operations. Gun trucks symbolized American military culture at its finest. Soldiers who refused to accept failure, improvised solutions with available materials, and proved courage combined with ingenuity overcomes doctrinal gaps. The crews who welded steel plates in motor pools, painted intimidating names on armor, and volunteered for constant combat weren't rejecting military discipline. They were exercising initiative that American military doctrine theoretically valued, but institutional inertia often suppressed. Their innovation succeeded because officers eventually acknowledged field-driven solutions worked better than waiting for authorized equipment that arrived years too late to save lives being lost daily. Most gun trucks were destroyed or abandoned in Vietnam, cut apart in salvage yards or left to rust, when withdrawal made shipping home impractical. Eve of Destruction survived and now sits in Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia, one of maybe a dozen preserved out of 300 to 400 that operated during war. The physical evidence disappeared, but legacy endured in every convoy that subsequently rolled with purpose-built armor and weapons. Modern convoy security doctrine traces lineage directly to September 1967 motor pools, where truck drivers decided survival trumped regulations, and welded steel plates onto cargo beds without permission. The final truth transcended Vietnam and Iraq. Sometimes the best military equipment is built by soldiers who refuse to die waiting for approval. Gun trucks proved that courage alone couldn't protect convoys, but courage combined with improvisation could transform vulnerable supply lines into defended routes where ambush became costly rather than one-sided. The young men who painted Eve of Destruction, Ace of Spades, and dozens of other names on armor plates left a legacy not measured in preserved vehicles, but in principle that endures across generations. When official systems fail and lives hang in balance, American soldiers will innovate solutions with whatever materials exist, mount whatever weapons they can acquire, and prove that ingenuity under fire writes better doctrine than peacetime planning ever conceived.